Welcome everyone to Howling Coyote. And we're especially privileged tonight to have a howling dog in the background. It's going to be very authentic. And I'm happy to welcome Patrick McFarlane, my colleague and friend, who's abandoned me for the wilds of Detroit, where he now lives instead of Orono, where we both used to live. And Patrick has been involved in looking at decolonization and in terms of mental health and other kinds of medicine. He's many things, a social worker, a family nurse practitioner, a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and soon to be a PhD from Memorial University in Newfoundland. So we're all trying to accumulate more initials after our names. It's sort of a northeastern version of where I grew up in Kentucky, where you would try to accumulate as many broken down mechanical devices as you to litter your yard. So Patrick, take it away.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, Lewis. As always, it's great to spend some time with you, and I'll be excited to sort of see what comes from the garden of these growing ideas in this discussion. And this is also sort of a prelude to a presentation that will be similar but different that we'll be doing in the Etowoptimum conference over the weekend. But as Lewis has said, I've been pretty interested in various anti-oppressive theory, medical phenomenology in particular, and phenomenology's use in training new medical providers and physicians to think about a philosophy and an approach to medicine that reveals the context of a patient. And so that said, I'm going to just share my slides. Away we go. Lewis promised howling dogs and perhaps howling electronica.
Yes, I don't know how that happened, but we'll see if we can prevent it.
Well, it's the call of all of our existence, I suppose. I'm gonna turn this into just the slideshow. There we go. All right, here we go. So, I mean, you can't think really about decolonization and psychotherapy and psychiatry specifically without referencing, I think, Frantz Fanon. And I took the title of this talk from a letter that he wrote where he described considering or reconsidering the idea that he could make a difference in psychiatry, from the inside, is changing something that has its sort of roots in colonial ideas is a very tricky business. Organizations tend to not change much. Maybe even people, struggle to change within systems. And so when the system needs to change, individuals sort of have a hard go of that. And throughout, I put some more contemporary art along the way, just because, as we'll learn from Fanon in a few minutes, he thought that, well, and like a certain Mehl-Madrona has taught me, that it's in getting people together to do art sometimes is one thing that people can do in the face of colonial systems, especially relating to counseling or psychotherapy or psychiatry. But this is a piece by Richard Martinez, who is from the Pueblo Nation, the title of which was Indians' World of the Best. I love this. This is a contemporary artist, Cara Romero, who took this, or structured and took this photograph. It's called The Last Indian Market. And this is at the Detroit Institute of the Arts. There's just a lot going on in this picture. But I do want to acknowledge that I am a settler colonist on the lands of many nations. In Maine, I exist on the unceded, stolen lands of the people of the Dawn, the nations of the Wabanaki Confederacy that include the Maliseet, the Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations. All of their people and their ways of knowing. And now I'm a settler colonist on the lands of the Great Lakes, the lands of the Anishinaabe Alliance, the Three Fires Council, and the people and the nations of the Chippewa, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, who had relations with a number of nations in the area, the Sac, Meskwaki, the Menominee, the Winnebago, the Iroquois, the Wyandot, and the Sioux, among others. And I specifically support the return of lands and the redress of land and treaty claims, reparation for harms, as well as an approach to knowing that now incorporates two-eyed seeing and multiple ways of being that seek to liberate and respect. So the goals of this presentation include just a brief introduction to the ideas about decolonizing medicine and specifically decolonizing counseling or therapy, introductions to key concepts in decolonizing therapy and approaches that are in various literatures, developing a place for discussing decolonizing counseling and therapy, which is hopefully what we do in this podcast. And I really want to honor somebody that I just began learning about, really, Louis Riel, who is a Métis, which is a Latin-rooted word that just means mixed, but who held that art helps frame and holds culture, and that art represents a decolonizing methodology for culture, health, medicine, and science. And I don't have any conflicts to declare. This is a piece by George Morrison that's also at the DAA. I love this. It's titled Landscape. And Morrison was an Ojibwe Anishinaabe artist. And he used these wood blocks to create this picture that depicts the horizons between the underground, the land, the water, the sky, of the various wood species, the wood people, and the tree beings that exist around the Great Lakes. So, I mean, one of the key issues about therapy, I mean, you know, there's a reason why there's plays written about this. You know, it's called talk therapy for a reason, and it requires you know, language, and you know, I would argue, hopefully, it requires a language of doing, but spirit, mind, and body, which are key constructs that have to be in harmony with one another, are certainly reflected in language. And one of the main problems of doing therapy, especially in English, is not having access to Indigenous language, and thus Indigenous ways of thinking, knowing, and it, you know, not having access to that language obviously shifts Indigenous thousands of ways of relating to a place, being, and doing. And as you, Louis, have pointed out to me a bunch of times, but is also supported in the literature, including you, but also beyond you. I mean, there's lots of other people who say this, that European languages are noun-based. So they're good at describing things in some detail, especially if you appreciate that European language tends to, the nouns tend to be naming places after often European people. Well, Indigenous language tend to be verb-based and about doing. So there's issues related to language, of course, in counseling and psychotherapy. And I didn't think I could do this talk without referencing again to one of my more recent heroes that I've learned about in my doctoral program. That's Linda Tuwe Smith, who's a Maori, who wrote a book called Decolonizing Methodologies. And basically, this is one of the most powerful paragraphs that I found in the book, though there are lots of them. But she said that arguments of different indigenous people based on spiritual relationships to the universe, to the landscape, and to stones, rocks, insects, and other things seen and unseen have been difficult for Western systems of knowledge to deal with or accept. Values, attitudes, concepts, and language embedded in beliefs about the spiritual represent in many cases the clearest contrast and a mark of difference between indigenous peoples in the West. It's one of the few parts of ourselves that the West cannot decipher, cannot understand, and cannot control yet, which is how she ended chapter 3 in her book. I already referenced Louis Riel once, and this is a quote that is attributed to him and that I found in a couple of dissertations that I read. But he said, "My people will sleep for 100 years, and when they awake, it will be the artists who give them their spirit back." And again, he was a Métis elder, a statesman, a rebellion leader. He ended up being hanged in Regina in 1885 for the killing of a Canadian nationalist, and they called it treason. But then later he was included as a founder among the several founding documents, and is considered to be a founder of Manitoba. And Frantz Fanon, again, is a psychiatrist who, in his letter resigning as a medical director of a psychiatric hospital in Algeria, and just set the scene here. This is in the era of a war between, the Algerians and French colonists. And he said, "Madness is one of the means man has of losing his freedom. And I can say on the basis of what I've observed from this vantage, that the degree of alienation of the inhabitants of this country appear to me frightening. If psychiatry is the medical technique that aims to enable man no longer to be a stranger to his environment, I owe it to myself to affirm that the Arab is a permanent alien in his own country and lives in a state of absolute depersonalization." He said, "Threatened in his affectivity, his social activity, threatened in his membership in community, the North African combines all of the conditions that make a sick man. Without family, without love, without human relations, without communion with a group, the first encounter with himself will occur in a neurotic mode, a pathologic mode. He will feel himself emptied without life in a bodily struggle with death. A death on this side of death, a death in life." And when I started reading Fanon, it reminded me a lot of what I've been reading about decolonizing efforts, both in medicine and in psychotherapy and counseling and approaches to trauma and things like that. But, part of the colonial enterprise is to carve up and separate people, to move them in ways in which they begin to have a lack of connection with place. And this is a theme that just comes up over and over again in this work. And this is one of the hopeful things, one of the happier times in Fanon's life prior to his work as the medical director at that hospital in Algeria. He was at St. Albans Hospital, which is, if within a system there was a progressive institution, this perhaps was more of one. And it reminds me a lot of what Lewis and Barb and other of my colleagues that I respect do, in their psychotherapy work. And he wrote, "If you could assemble a group of people in an open space, some crazy, some not, and give them the means to articulate and re-articulate who they were and how they were shaped by history, they could feel better." And one of this is from two papers that Fanon presented at conferences with this guy Toskel, where they had done psychodrama, made music, made art together with patients. And Fanon found this a meaningful application of psychiatry. And to me, this is echoed by Eduardo Duran, who wrote earlier, but we'll get to his book, The Soul Wound, in a minute, but the soul wound, or as Gaughan called it, the soul wound psychotherapy. Duran said, the core is the essence of the fabric of the soul. And from this essence, the mythology, dreams, culture emerge. The manifestations of such a wound are then embodied by the tremendous suffering that a people have undergone since the collective soul wound of half a millennium ago. And in Duran's book, The Healing the Soul Wound, he wrote, it would be naive to believe that simply making somebody aware of soul wounding would provide a magical solution. Excellent clinical interventions must be part of the overall strategy. And I know that for years now, Lewis, using the work of the Marshalls, has talked about two-eyed seeing as an approach to, add to the philosophic elements of knowledge and science production and connection. Maria Yellowhorse, a Braveheart, and she also used to have a hyphenated Jordan in her name, but years before that came up with this Lakota intervention model. And she talked about designing a 4-day cultural intervention model that had 4 essential components. And that included one, there's this intent to stimulate trauma memories about a generational past. And these aren't direct trauma to the individual. It's more like a collective trauma, like, for example, thinking about educational trauma as an example. 2, that at this intervention would be opportunities for group sharing, group identification, modeling of affect and self-regulation. 3, incorporation of traditional Lakota culture, ritual, and memorialization. And then facilitation of communal support and connection. And then there's this notion about, what is resilience from an Indigenous perspective? And there's a lot of people writing about this work now. I mean, I think when I looked in Google Scholar, there were something like 2,600 articles, related to this topic. So people are thinking about this, but Kermayer and his group, who wrote in the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry, said, these constructs of resilience are expressed through specific stories and metaphors that are grounded in culture and language. However, they can be framed more generally in terms of a process that includes regulating emotion, supporting adaptation through a relationship, ecocentric and cosmocentric concepts of self and personhood, revisioning collective history in ways that valorize the collective identity, revitalizing language and culture as resources for narrative self-fashioning, social positioning and healing, and renewing individual and collective agency through political activism, empowerment, and reconciliation. Each of these sources of resilience can be understood in dynamic terms as emerging from interactions between individuals and their communities and the larger regional, national, and global systems that locate resilience has important implications for mental health promotion, policy, and clinical practice. Noy, an African psychologist and writer, wrote, we have to consider also symbolic illnesses or ones with hidden meaning. Indigenous African peoples routinely persuade themselves that they must go beyond the information that is given. and to determine who is speaking through their illness and what they are expected to do to effect cure. In this way, they try to set their eyes not only on what is happening to the sick one, the observable manifestations of the illness, but also on the question of identifying the agent behind its onset and escalation in their approach for questioning the misfortune. So this article draws attention to the missing link in Western paradigm to psychopathology and treatment that makes it unable to deal decisively with certain illness presentations of the Black African client. This is from Northwest India. The Ladakh, psychological distress is treated as possession, necessitating identification or expulsion or control of a possessing agent. On marriage, young women are commonly afflicted, and men suffering stress from a variety of causes may also be affected. Aid for an individual may be sought from various helpers, but a common treatment occurs in a seance with a shamanic oracle healer. These oracles are women or men who have themselves passed through the initiatory possession. An appeal may be made to a high lama of a local monastery who places a persistent possessing agent under vow and manifests itself only when requested in order to help others to go through oracular pronouncements or healing. To achieve this, the afflicted must undergo training. And the current theory of shamanic behavior is examined to suggest that the prime mover is psychological pressure within gender, family, or social relations that requires some sort of an adjustment to this individual's sense of identity. Oracular consultation in trance is viewed as a mediating process, limiting the potential for social discord, where interfamilial reciprocation is a vital aspect of a social life. So, I mean, essentially, if you accept that there's an environment and a place from which it is important to understand problems emerging, the DSM becomes a very limiting, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, sort of the Bible of what it is that we in the West call things. It is important that we consider the power, threat, meaning framework, if you will, that's important to go along with trauma-informed perspectives. And that it's important that in conventional cognitive behavioral therapy was less accepted given its emphasis on rational thinking, while narrative approaches were more successful given the widespread uses of storytelling in these cultures, and the emphasis on relationship is much more important than being rational. Trained peer counselors were very helpful, and bringing culture, language, song, ceremony, elders, and art into treatment was highly desirable. And Lewis, do you recognize that as elements of your article that you wrote, which you did with Lisa and Barbara, modifying psychiatric approaches to better respond to Indigenous people. So my goal was to sort of set a stage where we might talk about how these elements of decolonization or indigenization of therapeutic approaches, might be talked about, and to make this a space where, we could have a conversation about that, given your experience over your lifetime and my experience, having worked where I've been working for the past few years. I think you're muted.
I am a mutant, that is clear. I was saying it's a complicated question because, in our lives, which are saturated with neoliberal capitalism. We play out in all our contexts these hierarchical relationships of power and control. And my experience has been that Indian country doesn't really change that. That it's so saturated our work lives that it doesn't alter. No one alters it. I mean, if we were serious about decolonizing, we would do talking circles, and we would talk to consensus, and it would not be, chief executive officer rules, the rest of you get in line. I think it would be very different than what it is in most of our contexts. And we've just gotten so used to hierarchies that I don't think we know how to overthrow them. I don't think we know how to function without them. We don't really know how to create a team of equal beings.
Mm.
And I suspect that's so desperately what we need. I had the experience once in my hippie youth of working at a community health center where everybody was paid the same. And, the receptionist, the doctor, the nurse, everyone got the same salary. It died. But it was a beautiful experiment. I mean, it was a meaningful experiment. And it was, of course, in Berkeley, California. And we were the only clinic providing maternity services to women on Medicaid in the whole city, the whole region, really, except for the county hospital in Oakland. And it's the closest that I ever came to being non-hierarchical. But I also went broke. So what can I say?
You saying that reminds me of a conversation we had a couple of weeks ago when I described working with one of the tribal nations around integrated healthcare, which is just an idea about making sure that there's accessible, counseling or talk therapy interventions and medical interventions that are, coexist and that theoretically work together. And we had begun exploring ideas about decolonizing medicine and what's often called culturally informed care, or those kinds of an idea, maybe a year ago. But as we got closer to implementing a model of integrated care, and mind you, this is within the tribal health center that is backed up by the Indian Health Service in the United States. They uploaded standard forms that have probably been cobbled together out of 30 years of experience for psychological intakes or counseling intakes. And there was nothing different about them at all in fact, they were sort of old fashioned, like probably somebody had cobbled this together from 25 years of just questions that people get asked. And there was nothing in it about culture. There was nothing in it about ceremony. There was nothing in it about narrative. How do you think you got sick? What do you think you need to do to get better? Spiritual questions or the like. And when I pointed that out, the response was, well, this is what we had.
Right. We've been colonized.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we just put together a sort of a symptom screening questionnaire at Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness, where I work, and that we start off with, and we've set it up so it just gets emailed to people, and they answer it and just hit submit, and it comes back to us. But it's this cool British part of it, at least, is this cool British questionnaire, which is called the MyMOP, My Medical Outcomes Profile 2, which you and I have used in research, and it simply says what bothers you the most, and how bad is it, and what bothers you next, and how bad is it, and how much is it affecting your quality of life and your activities of daily living. And I think that's a little better than what we usually do. And the other thing that I've been promoting is life story interviews, as you know. And that's how I'm doing my psychiatric intakes. I'm really doing a life story interview, because I get most of what I would need for the conventional questions, and I get it in a more meaningful, heartfelt way. So I saw someone today, for the first time, and so I always ask people, so what brings us together? What do you hope to accomplish? And then, she explained some things, and then I said, so where were you born? And it changed the whole, flavor of the room, and then I said, so, how long did you live there? And she said 2 days, because she was from a northern Ontario reserve, and her mother had been flown to Toronto to give birth. And so back they went to their reserve. And I just kept asking her, I said, well, then how long did you stay on this reserve? And 2 years. And then I said, well, then where did you go? What happened next? And so they moved to a suburb of Toronto. And I said, and then what happened? And they moved, further southwest. And it is just such a more interesting way to get a history than the conventional ones that we use. And I feel like it's decolonizing. I mean, maybe not completely, but it's a different way of talking to people. I mean, it's getting the story of their life instead of like 20 questions.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I feel like, and I mean, I don't know that this is just a wish, but I feel like that piece about endless curiosity, and then all of the ways in which someone explains their experience, that's where the potential for change and action is. And I believe that part is decolonizing. If I had $10 for every time somebody told me, I mean, just think about patient presentations that we get inpatient. And both you and I have worked inpatient a chunk. room 103, a bipolar 44-year-old, and as if bipolar is bipolar is bipolar is bipolar. What the hell is bipolar? Like we just never really get to, or seldom get to, the context of that person's experience. And I feel like it's very decolonizing. It's very standing against the system to, inquire about that narrative. Because in my experience, bipolar is not bipolar, is not bipolar, is not bipolar.
Well, and I think you and I are in agreement that the conventional diagnoses were thrown together by a bunch of white men over 50 in a hotel room in Baltimore in the 1950s, and they have no scientific validity. And of course, this is one of my sort of pet projects, is to try and convince people to move from these diagnoses to brain circuits, and to talk about like which of your circuits are wonky, what's not functioning well for you. Is it your go to the grocery circuit, or is it your tell stories circuit, or is it your fear and loathing circuit? What's out of balance, and how do we correct it? Which is, I think, that's more decolonized than giving people nouns. Like what we do in psychiatry is we take our shovels, trowels, and we push it into the diagnosis bucket, and we come out with some nouns, and we throw it at the person, and we see which ones stick. It's like, well, you're bipolar, PTSD, major depression, and generalized anxiety disorder, all of which are tremendously overlapping. And the whole thing makes no sense.
And I appreciate what you're talking about with the research domain criterion. Really the manifestation of whatever brain circuitry, be it the seeking system and dopamine or what have you. But my bias is that it's far less about a brain circuit, and it's certainly far less about those nouns than it is about the context, experience, background of the individual. And to really be decolonized, in my view, means that we understand that context, that we do the work of understanding the history and the depth of place. And like Fanon says, that we do everything possible to help the person reconnect with an identity, to develop their own identity with place and purpose. And I don't know that you can get that. And don't get me wrong, the danger in all of this too, especially about, white dabblers, is this kind of notion that, if we all just took some spiritual approach, based on, history of a place, and then encourage everybody to do ceremony, whatever that means in their own way. But I know plenty of Indigenous people who, don't have a connection to those things. So what does it mean to be Indigenous in Detroit, Michigan, and a rap artist, versus, Indigenous in, Sabayak, Maine? And how do you make sense of place? Because that person who's in Detroit needs that sense of place and connection as much as the person in Sabayak and yet the manifestation of that is incredibly different. Yeah, a friend of mine the other day was just talking about going birding for the first time and realizing how out of touch he was with the different animals and flora and that surround us here. So how is it that you part of capitalism and colonialism is moving people around for the purpose of means of production and distancing them from a place. So how is it that in a two-eyed seeing sort of approach, we help people put their roots in the ground of wherever it is that they are, indigenous or not, is a critical decolonizing approach, in my view.
Yeah, we all need to belong, and we have to belong somewhere or to something. And I think we spend a lot of time figuring out where we belong. And some of us never figure it out. I mean, some of us never figure out. Some of us never belong. But it's complicated because I see people from all of the reservations in Maine, and many of them have a kind of sense of belonging without belonging. Like they know they are, say, Pescata Makati or Maliseet, but they don't know what that means. They don't, well, it doesn't go further than a kind of raincoat identity. And
a noun.
Yeah, a noun. It's not a verb. And if we could figure out how to make it a verb, that would be awesome. But it's not simplistic. It's not like teaching them how to make baskets isn't going to do it. Like it's narrative and not instrumental. So and it's all I would say that it's also spiritual because it's about connecting to one's ancestral lineage in a direct communication manner, which places me dangerously in the woo-woo zone. But or the indigenous zone, depending on your point of view. But I think we can feel belonging to our lineage, or we can feel belonging to our. Well, I spent time with Thich Nhat Hanh. Well, I spent a month once with Thich Nhat Hanh, and I was impressed with his presentation of multiple lineages. He said you have your biological lineage, and then he said you have your reincarnational lineage, the friends that you choose to reincarnate with over and over and over and over, which seemed kind of fun. And then he said you have your spiritual lineage, which are the teachers of whatever spirituality you're following. And I think there were two other lineages that I'm forgetting right now, but I thought, oh, so there's there's at least 5 modes of belonging. So if I'm not doing well with my biological lineage, I can switch into my reincarnational lineage. If that's not working well, I could switch over to my spiritual lineage. And if that's not working well, there was somewhere else I could go that I'm forgetting, but that seemed good to have lots of
Many roads to Rome.
many roads to Rome. Yeah. Well, because all the taxes went to Rome. Yeah. But I think I was thinking my current favorite philosopher is Hart Rosa. And he talks a lot about alienation. It's the name of one of his books. And he says that is the consequence of neoliberal capitalism.
Mm.
That it alienates us from each other, from the work that we do, from finding meaning in the work that we do. I mean, of course, Marx talked about that, as in Das Kapital, the alienation of the worker from production. But Rosa means it in a more profound sense of being alienated from everything. The more individualistic we become, the more isolated we become, and the more disconnected we become. And his solution is to find resonance. Though, my friend Marquis Bureau, who introduced me to Rosa, has read Resonance, his final book, to the end, which I haven't quite gotten to yet. And I said, Marquis, I said, so what's the solution? And he said, oh, sociologists never have solutions. They only have explanations. So how do we move from alienation to resonance? Rosa doesn't know because he's a sociologist. and I don't know either. I don't know that. I mean, I just remember the most profound thing I ever heard the Dalai Lama say. And it was a panel on why do we need world peace? And everyone else on the panel gave these erudite explanations. And the Dalai Lama just said, so we can have more friends. We all need more friends.
I
And
love that.
yeah. And I suppose that's resonance, is making more friends, having more friends.
Yeah, this is where I can slide off into call it what you will, woo-woo. But I mean, the whole point of having friends is to be able to love them up. And my lovely partner Will always tells me that it's my religion that love leads to problems and love leads to solutions, but love is certainly action. And I'm a fan of the Dalai Lama and friends. And I think oftentimes in working with people in psychotherapy, I have my own defense about that, which is always that I think, why the hell did I choose this as a career? I don't want another person to know other troubles. I already know these stories about how terrible we can all be to each other and what abuse looks like. And then I meet the person, and within a few times of meeting them and coming to know their story, I find ways to love them. And I think within boundaries, the kind of, elements of love that come out in therapy, and especially as described in all these, decolonizing therapy sort of ideas, link letters, 10 or 11 stages, like that whole thing about balance, harmony, being in creation, care and compassion, community, support and challenge for wellness, respect. All of these sorts of ideas are, in my view, founded in the construct of love. I think you're muted again for me.
Oh, I was a mutant again. I said, as John Lennon said, all you need is love. All you need. Love is all you need.
Well, I like that as a 5 o'clock bookend to our 4 o'clock start. So,
Yeah, yeah. It all comes down to
Are
that.
you guys gonna do a dialogue?
So,
You know what I mean?
Barb wants to know if we're doing a dialogue on the weekend. I think Patrick is presenting, and if he runs out of things to say, we'll do a dialogue.
well, yeah, you could count on the dialogue for, I'll give you a good half an hour, and then well, I'm going to add some more art and maybe some stories, just from my practice and experience.
Yeah, that'll be good. All right. Well, I think we've said enough for one evening.
Enjoy. And you want to stop recording for now?
Going to stop recording. I must find it first.